Outside Looking In, International Perspectives on U.S. Foreign Policy, funded by the government of the student body. We're pleased to welcome Michael Tarazi to campus on his topic, What Happened on the Road to Peace? Michael Tarazi works with the Negotiations Affairs Department of the Palestine Liberation Organization. He is a legal advisor providing advice and assistance on issues of refugees, settlements, borders, and Jerusalem to the Palestinian team in peace negotiations with Israel. Previously, he was the European General Counsel at Euronet Services, a securities attorney for the law firm of White and Case, and he was associated with the law firm of Paul, Weiss, Rifkind, Wharton, and Garrison in Paris. He received his undergraduate and law degrees from Harvard University and is a member of the New York State Bar. Please join me in welcoming Michael Tarazi. And if you could please also turn off your cell phones, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar and Pat and the Committee on Lectures for inviting me this evening. It's a pleasure to be here in Iowa. And thank you all for making the time to be here this evening. I hope it'll be informative and enjoyable for you. I have to admit, I always get a little bit nervous. Even though I've given this presentation, I still get a little bit nervous because every time I speak before a crowd, I'm haunted by something my mother once told me before I went on to speak before a crowd. Is this actually okay? Is that better? I was just saying, I still get a little bit nervous because I'm haunted by something my mom once told me. I called her up once and I said, do we need to turn? I just can't get too close to it.
Just take this right off of there for now.
Let me try this again. Just walk over here. Okay, looks like it's working. For the third time, let me tell you why I'm nervous. I called up my mom once and I said, Mom, I'm a little bit nervous. I got to speak before this crowd tonight. And, do you have any advice for me? And she thought for a while. And she said to me in Arabic, "Mad zahet nas," which Arabic speakers realize translates into, "Don't be boring." Thanks, Mom. So at any rate, out of deference to my mother, I promise that I will try not to be boring this evening, but if I should fail, please do not call my mom. I'm going to talk about a number of issues this evening. I'm going to start first about what actually happened at the negotiations. What are the big issues that still separate Palestinians and Israelis from a permanent status agreement? The second thing I'm going to talk about is what are some creative solutions to those big issues? How can we solve those issues? And the third thing I'm going to talk about is, given the array of creative options to these issues, why are we then not reaching an agreement? So let me start with the first thing. I'm going to talk about Camp David. And people say, why do you talk about Camp David? That's from like July 2000. It's like almost 40 years old already. It's ancient news. Unfortunately, it's not ancient news because that's where the mythology starts. And the mythology goes, and I'm sure you've all heard it because I certainly heard it and even believed it for a while. You Palestinians were offered everything you ever wanted at Camp David. You simply hate Jews more than you want peace, so you walked away from this generous offer of Barak and started blowing yourselves up in the streets of Tel Aviv, and therefore we don't have a peace partner, and therefore we're justified in doing everything we want to you until you produce a leadership that will accept what we offer. That's the simple black and white narrative. And what I'm going to talk about is Camp David. I'm going to start with Camp David because that's where the narrative begins. If you want to pull out that brick upon which the house is built, you'll see that all the other mythologies, that Arafat's not a peace partner, the Palestinians got this generous offer, you have to start thinking about then what really is going on. Because without knowing what really is going on, you're not going to be able to solve the problem. So let me start with Camp David. Now this is the map of Camp David, the so-called generous offer of Barak. I even hate that terminology, generous offer, as if it's Israel and it's offering out of its kindness to the Palestinians rather than this is what the Palestinians are entitled to. But at any rate, this is what was called the generous offer. And the Israelis will never show you this map. They love talking about how generous they were, about how they offered the Palestinians everything, and they talk in general terms, but they'll never show you a map. Isn't that strange? You'd think they'd be advertising this map all over the world if they're trying to prove how great they are. But they don't show you, if you don't show you the map, I promise I'll take all sorts of questions afterwards. But they don't show you the map. So, what are they trying to hide from you? Well, rather than go through all of this map and say, oh, look how horrible, the offer was, I'm going to teach you to be your own Palestinian negotiator. I'm going to tell you what we look for when we sit down and negotiate with the Israelis. There are three things. The first thing is viability. Are we going to be able to survive as a state? Do we have enough natural resources? Can we develop our economy? The second thing we're looking for is true independence. Are we really free, or are we still subject to Israel's control? And the third thing we're looking for is choice. And with respect to choice, I'm talking about the refugees. Let me start with the first issue, viability. Are we going to be able to survive? Now, the first thing you're going to notice, this is a map of the West Bank right here. It's blown up. The West Bank and the Gaza Strip, for those of you who are not informed, are only 22% of historic Palestine. In other words, the territories that were occupied in 1967 are only 22%. Israel took 78% of historic Palestine in 1948. And we Palestinians who are accused of not compromising have said, okay, we recognize Israel on 78%, and we'll take the 22% that was occupied in 1967. And the Israelis said, no. What's ours is ours. What's yours is negotiable. In other words, thank you very much for that 78%, we're going to put it in our pocket, and now we're going to negotiate over the remaining 22. Just to give you an idea of how small a territory we're talking about. All of Israel is about the size of New Jersey. So in other words, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which have about 3.2 million people, roughly the population of Iowa, I'm told, in 22% of New Jersey. Imagine squeezing all people of Iowa into that territory. It gets worse, as I'll show you later on. But the first thing you're going to notice with respect to viability is that the Israelis said, okay, you take these big three areas here of the West Bank. We're going to divide it through a corridor in the north and a corridor in the center, which means that the West Bank is going to be separated into three separate, non-contiguous territories, meaning they, coupled with Gaza, the Gaza Strip in the south, that would mean that the Palestinian state is going to be four separate, non-contiguous territories. And what does that mean? Well, it's not just a question of being able to move around within my own country, my freedom of movement within my own country. Let's say I am from Nablus here in the north, and I want to go to Bethlehem in the south. I have to go through not one, but two Israeli checkpoints. Imagine you want to go from here to Minneapolis, and a foreign country decides in two separate areas whether or not you're going to be able to go move around within your own country. More importantly, it's a question of freedom of movement of goods and services, our ability to develop our economy. I'm a farmer in Gaza. I want to sell my produce way up in the north. I have to go through one to get out of Gaza, two here in Jerusalem, three checkpoints in the north in order to be able to sell my own produce in my own country to my fellow countrymen. So with respect to the viability, our ability to develop our own economy and to make us a real viable state is going to be controlled by Israel. What else with respect to viability? Now, you hear the percentages. The Israelis always talked about around Camp David, we offered them 93% of the occupied West Bank. We offered them 95%. I heard 97%. I even heard Netanyahu say that they offered us 100% of the West Bank. But it's not about percentages. Don't believe this talk of percentages. It's there to mislead you. Because the way Israel defines West Bank is not the way you and I in international law defines the West Bank. All of this is the West Bank. But Israel carves away East Jerusalem and says, no, that's not occupied territory, we annex that. So they carve away some prime real estate from that pie. They take away here the Latrun Valley, which is another area, that little bubble that extends into Israel. They carve that away as well. And the only way we were able to figure out how the Israelis came up with this 95% figure is if you put in the surface area of the Dead Sea. You take out the prime real estate, you add in the surface area of the Dead Sea, and you say, okay, 95%, you pat yourself on the back about how generous you are. But it's not about percentages. We could get 150% of the West Bank. That's not necessarily enough. Think of a prison. 95% of a prison belongs to the prisoners. The jail cells, the cafeteria, the workout area, the health facilities. It's the 5% the prison guards hold on to that allow them to control the prisoner population inside. And that's exactly what Israel is doing here. They gave us large prison cells, but by controlling the area around those prison cells, they got to control us inside. But what was that 5% or 7% or whatever percent it was the Israelis wanted to hold on to? Well, you'll see there's primarily two areas. In addition to East Jerusalem, you have this Ariel block here in the north and Gush Etzion in the south. Ariel is named after this settlement right here, Ariel, one of the largest settlements in the West Bank. And the Israelis come up to us and they say, well, you know, this is where so many of our settlers live. And so therefore it's just impractical for us to move them back into Israel. And so therefore we're just going to have to annex all of this land and you have to compromise. By the way, when people talk about compromise, it's always about what Palestinians are going to give up. It's never about what the Israelis are going to give up. That's another euphemism. So in the spirit of compromise, we just have to give up this land. But you know what? The Israelis aren't telling you something. Remember, there are two kinds of settlers. For those of you who aren't familiar, there are about 400,000 Israeli civilians living in occupied Palestinian territory in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention and international law. They're called settlers, and they live in about 150 or more illegal Israeli settlements in occupied Palestinian territory. Why are there so many settlers? Well, there are two kinds. One are the religious ideologues, the Gush Emunim, Party of the Faithful. God gave this land to us, and so therefore we have to redeem it by moving in. They're a minority, about 20%. The vast majority of settlers are economic settlers. They have been incentivized to move into the West Bank by the Israeli government through all sorts of financial subsidies, including income tax benefits, subsidized mortgages, in some cases business subsidies. But that still doesn't answer the question. Why has Israel moved all of these settlers into this area in particular? The answer you don't see on the map, but the answer is water. Now there are 4 different water aquifers along the West Bank and inside and below Israel. But this area in particular is what's known as a high recharge area. It's where the water flows into fastest. It's an easy access area, which means you can get to that water easily. And most importantly, it's a very pure water, which is very important because the coastal aquifer along the Mediterranean has been so depleted by Israel that it's actually fallen below sea level and been contaminated by salt water from the Mediterranean. And so therefore a pure water source is a very scarce commodity. And that's why Israel has moved in so many settlers into this area from the very beginning, because they knew this was a water resource area they wanted to take when it came to permanent status negotiations. Why am I telling you this? Go back to the viability test. We have no ability to develop an economy. We have no ability to freely move around in our own country. And now we have no water, or at least a large part of our water sources are being taken by Israel. That fails the viability test. The second test, true independence. Now, there's no Israeli, at least not in the mainstream, not even Yossi Beilin, who is held to be sort of this progressive left-wing peacenik inside Israel, who talk about a genuinely sovereign Palestinian state. A sovereign state is a state that has the right to defend itself and have an army, right? Not so by the Israelis. They don't allow us to have a military. And a sovereign state can enter into treaties with other countries. Not so for Palestine, because the Israelis said, no, you can't enter into treaties with other countries. So we're not even talking about true independence yet, even among those Israelis who favor a Palestinian state and consider themselves to be so generous, quote unquote. But it gets worse than that. Most states can control their own borders, who comes in, who goes out. Now take a look at what the Israelis did here. You see along the Jordan Valley, the Israelis said, that's part of the Palestinian state. That's part of the 90 whatever percent we're going to give you. But you're going to lease it back to us. And we asked them, well, how long do you want to lease this for exactly? And their first response, 999 years. In other words, our ability to go in and out of our country, again, is controlled by Israel. And our ability to move our own goods and services, to develop an economy, import and export internationally, is controlled by Israel. Most sovereign states can control their own airspace. Not the Palestinian state. You don't see it here on the map, but all of Palestinian airspace is going to be controlled by Israel. Now, to me and you, that sounds like it's a question of simply airplanes flying in and out. It's a lot more than that. It's electromagnetic sphere. It's mobile phone services. It's satellite TV. Who knows what kind of technology will develop that you'll need to access your own airspace. Now, we have a mobile phone service in the Palestinian territories, but it's subject to Israel's permission. Israel decides what kind of bandwidth we're going to get, what kind of access to satellites we're going to get, and if Israel decides that we're not going to get it, then we don't get it. That is not a truly sovereign, independent state. So with respect to viability, we fail. With respect to true independence, we fail. And before I go on to the issue of choice for the refugees, let me move on to the other map, because this is misleading. This is not the furthest we came during negotiations. I start with this because the chronology goes Camp David, the uprising starts, and then we get to Taba, which is 6 months after Camp David, in which we pursued negotiations, and we did make significant progress. So I don't want you to believe that this is the furthest we ever came, but this was the generous offer, quote unquote, that we apparently rejected, and I'm explaining to you why. This map is a map that the Israelis actually did put their name to, or at least one Israeli did. It's this one right here. Shlomo Ben Ami, one of the Israeli negotiators, actually did say that this was the map at Taba. And you'll see some significant progress. First of all, you don't have that leaseback arrangement of the Jordan Valley, so Palestinians did finally control their own borders, at least international borders with Jordan. The West Bank was not divided into 3 separate areas, although you did have sizable areas that were going to be annexed. It does not cut all the way through, so we did have contiguous territory. The big issues were still, of course, Jerusalem, as you see, that Israel planned on holding on to, including East Jerusalem, which is an occupied territory. This area here, the Ariel Block in the north, and its water resources that I outlined earlier, and of course the issue of refugees. Now, part of my job, when I first moved to the West Bank, was to go into Israel and speak with Israelis in private homes and in theaters and universities, like I'm speaking to you now. And I would explain to them the position on Camp David and what the Palestinians were actually seeking. And then they would say, look, in terms of geography, take the West Bank, all of it, take East Jerusalem. That's not our concern. It's only 22% of Palestine anyway. That's not what concerns us. But don't talk to us about millions of Christians and Muslim Palestinian refugees returning to Israel, the Jewish state. That is our existential threat. That's what it means to be a Jewish state. And if you accept the idea of 2 states, then you have to accept the idea that this state is a Jewish one and we're not going to compromise that. I understand that. But I can't possibly agree with that. What are they really saying? They're saying a Jewish state is a state that has the right to discriminate against Christians and Muslims. My grandmother is from what is Israel today. I can't go home. Why? Because I'm Christian. If I convert to Judaism, I'm allowed to return. But because I'm a Christian, I'm not. A Jew from Iowa can return to Israel. I, whose parents and grandparents and ancestry as far back as we know is from there, I'm not allowed to return. This is religious discrimination in its most blatant form. We would never tolerate that anywhere else in the world. If people said, oh, we're not going to allow Jews to return here, we would say, no, that's anti-Semitism. And take a look, this is like as if Milosevic had won in Bosnia. And he said, in Kosovo. He said, I can't allow all these Kosovar Albanians to return to Kosovo. That would disrupt the Serbian character of the Serbian heartland. And besides, they're all Albanian anyway, let them go to Albania. And the world said, no, that's called ethnic cleansing. We're not going to tolerate that. And yet Israel is in effect saying the same thing. We can't allow all these Christians and Muslims to come back to Israel. That would disrupt the Jewish character of the Jewish state. And besides, they're all Arabs anyway. Let them go to the other Arab countries. And yet there, the world sort of nods its head and says, oh yes, you're right. Now I say this not to show how discriminatory Israel is and how discriminatory in practice Zionism is. I say this to explain how difficult it is to reach an agreement if the only thing we can say to millions of refugees is, sorry, you're the wrong religion. That's not going to work. All we'll do is we'll create an alternative PLO the minute that agreement is signed. So we say, how can we balance Israel's demographic concerns, as discriminatory as I believe those concerns to be, with the Palestinian right of return? And it is a right under international law. People have the right to return to their homes after fleeing a war zone. And we say, give the refugees choices. Allow them to empower themselves, because that's really what a refugee is, a disempowered person. Give them the ability to decide for themselves what they want to do with their lives. And we say, well, here's some choices. Choice one, stay where you are. You are a millionaire refugee in Ames, Iowa. You don't even know where Palestine is. You have no desire to return. Okay, we're not going to force you to go back. We can talk about compensation, which of course is in addition to any choice that they make. Or let's say you're a refugee in Lebanon, and you've intermarried, and you want to stay in Lebanon. You have a business, but you want a Lebanese passport. We can talk to the Lebanese government, and we can say, okay, how many refugees are you willing to accept in exchange for other refugees taking other options? Option two, go to a third country. Canada a few years ago said that it would be willing to take refugees as part of its share in resolving the crisis. And it's funny because, I live in Ramallah on the West Bank, and I was talking to friends of mine, and I said, yeah, one of the options may be that refugees get to go to Canada. And he said, no, you bring the refugees here to Ramallah. We'll go to Canada instead. Option three. Option three. Go to the Palestinian state. Don't say return to the Palestinian state, because it's not a right of return, because that's not where they're from. They're from what is now Israel. But maybe they'd be happier in the Palestinian state. Hopefully it's big enough to accommodate them. Hopefully it has water resources. Hopefully we can develop our own economy. Maybe that's where they prefer to be. It's the dominant culture, the dominant language, by and large the dominant religion. They know the food. That's up to them to choose whether or not that's where they want to go. But option four is and has to be return to your homes in what is now Israel. That's their right, and denying them their right is not going to lead to any sort of peaceful agreement. So I talk about some of the creative solutions for refugees. Let's talk about some of the creative solutions for the settlements. I'm just going to show you this map again. And again, just to remind you, we have this area here that Israel says they have so many settlements, so many settlers living there, and so they just have to annex the territory. And we say, wait a minute. We understand that you, Israel, have moved in these settlers in violation of international law. And we understand that you have now created a big mess out of the whole situation. But it's not going to be fixed at our expense. We have some other creative solutions. Again, options. Option one. You incentivized all of these settlers to move into occupied territory. Stop the incentives and incentivize them to move back. We can give you a transition period of a few years, 3 years, 5 years, whatever you need. And during the transition period, you will reverse that whole colonization of the occupied territories by encouraging these people to go back into Israel. Another option, we can talk about sort of a green card system like we have here in the United States. They can remain as Israeli citizens, but living in the foreign country of Palestine, subject to Palestinian law. That happens all over the world. Third option, make them Palestinian citizens. Remember, Palestinian nationalism is not like Zionism. Zionism is the Jewish national movement. It is only about Jews, and it is very discriminatory and exclusive. Palestinian nationalism is about the people who live there. Yes, most of us are Muslim. Yes, most of us are Arab. But I'm a Christian Palestinian. We have Palestinians of Armenian origin, Greek origin, Bosnian origin, African origin. There is nothing inconsistent with the term Jewish Palestinian. And in fact, the Palestine National Charter that's been so vilified here in the United States specifically said Jews resident in Palestine are to be full citizens, as are Christians and Muslims. We base ourselves on a more democratic vision of nationalism like we have here in the United States, where everybody lives together as an equal and does not define the character of the state based on one particular religion or ethnicity. So those are some creative solutions for the issue of the settlement. What about Jerusalem? You'll see Jerusalem right here, which is blown up. And again, just some background. Israel took 85% of Jerusalem in 1948, as Jerusalem was defined in 1948. There were only 6 square kilometers that fell under the Jordanian occupation, including the Old City. And what Israel has done is they've expanded the borders of Jerusalem to include these orange dots here, which are these illegal Israeli settlements. Half of the 400,000 settlers in the occupied territories live in East Jerusalem alone. And again, the Israelis say, thank you very much for all of West Jerusalem, now we're going to negotiate over East Jerusalem. And we say, wait a minute. Another option. Why don't we build a ring road around all of Jerusalem, east and west, and inside that road will be an open, undivided city. Anyone trying to enter in that city will have free access regardless of religion, regardless of nationality. And when you leave that city, you show your passport to the Palestinian customs officials when you go into Palestine, and you show your passport to the Israeli customs officials when you go into Israel. But the city itself operates as one undivided city. And we talk about having a joint city council or city panel that can organize the city internally based on the green line, the border between what Israel took in 1948 and the occupied territories. And we administer it in such a way as to protect religious access and national access of Israelis and Arabs and Jews, Christians, and Muslims. So given that we have creative solutions for Jerusalem, creative solutions for the refugees, creative solutions for the settlements, why don't we have a solution to this conflict? Because Israel's not interested in creative solutions. There is one primary motivating factor that drives Israel as a nation, and if you remember this, you will be able to understand just about everything Israel has ever done and everything Israel will do. What motivates Israelis for peace has nothing to do with mutual reconciliation, has nothing to do with seeing me as an equal and applying international law. It has to do with getting rid of the demographic threat. We are more than 3 million Christians and Muslims in their Jewish state, and they don't want us. They have to find a place to get rid of us, and we'll call it a state if we have to, but that's the primary motivating factor. And they talk about it openly. They talk about separation. We want a separation from the Palestinians. Not how do we live with them side by side, how do we separate from them, how do we get rid of them? And it's a little bit more complicated because while they want to get rid of the people, they also very much want to hold on to our land. And this is the paradigm that explains just about everything Israel does, and I'm going to show you the evidence. But the paradigm is, how do we get Palestinian land while not taking the Palestinians who live on that land? That's the challenge for Israel. And what you'll see is that everything it does falls squarely into that paradigm. Now let me give you the evidence. Imagine you're Israel in 1994, you just had an uprising by the civilian population under your occupation, you have this demographic threat. What do? You somehow have to get rid of them. You sign Oslo. The Oslo Peace Accords resulted in this map. This is what the reality of the situation looks like today. The red area is Israeli controlled. Well within the green line, you'll see the occupied West Bank right here, and you'll see that the vast majority of it is still controlled by Israel. Those yellow dots, those reservations, are 13 separate reservations in the West Bank, comprising 17.2% of the geography of the West Bank, and that is what the Palestinians actually control. In other words, the Palestinians control 17.2% of 22%. But what you don't see on this map is that in those yellow reservations live approximately 80 to 85% of the Palestinian population, excluding East Jerusalem. In other words, Oslo was brilliant in terms of that paradigm. And what did our critics say, Edward Said and the others during Oslo? They said, why would we sign this? We see what the Israelis get out of it. First of all, they withdraw from the population centers, and then they get to argue there is no occupation anymore, because 85% of the population is no longer under our direct occupation, they're now under the Palestinian Authority. We get to bring in the Palestinian Authority from the outside to act as our security subcontractor. So now we have someone to blame when we have security problems, rather than blame ourselves. And of course, we've seen that over the last 3 years. How often have we heard, Arafat needs to do more? That's all we hear among Israel, and unfortunately that's all we hear here in the White House. As if it's the role of an occupied population to provide security to the occupied. That's totally reversing the reality of the situation. Under international law, it's the occupying power that is obligated to enforce the rights and protect the rights of the Palestinian civilian population under occupation. But no, it has been so distorted that now it is the people living under occupation who have to give security to the occupying power. A brilliant strategic move by the Israelis. They then also get to save themselves a lot of money because they don't have to pay for the Palestinian infrastructure, they don't have to pave roads, they don't have to give health facilities, they don't have to give sewage treatment. They bring in the Europeans and the Americans to a much lesser degree, the Europeans, the Asians, and to a much lesser degree the Americans, to pay now for the Palestinian infrastructure, so the Israelis get to save themselves a lot of money. And best of all, they get to hold on to 83% of the occupied West Bank. What better example of how to get rid of people while holding on to the majority of their land do you want, other than what Oslo actually did? That's a perfect example of Israeli strategy in action. And indeed, during the 7 or 8 years after Oslo was signed, in other words, during those 8 years of peace negotiations, the number of settlers in occupied territory doubled. Doubled. In other words, during those 8 years of peace negotiations, Israel moved in as many settlers as they had during the 20-something years of occupation prior to that. And there's a doctor in the West Bank named Mustafa Barghouti. He says, it's like you and I are negotiating over a piece of pizza. How much of the pizza do I get? How much do you get? And while we're negotiating it, you keep eating it. How am I supposed to believe I'm going to get a fair deal? And in fact, Palestinians stopped believing they were going to get a fair deal. They saw the process grind to a halt, and they no longer believed in that process. Now let's see how that paradigm played itself out in Camp David. I showed you this map. Take a look at Jerusalem. Remember President Clinton? He said, his solution for Jerusalem, what's Jewish shall be Israel, what's Arab shall be Palestine. What's wrong with that? How can you argue against that? It sounds so fair, it sounds so logical, but what's he saying? Were you there? He was saying all of these illegal Israeli settlements, these orange blocks that you see here, the 200,000 inside the occupied territories in East Jerusalem, are going to be legitimized. And these Arab neighborhoods here, these dark green areas that don't even connect to each other, will be part of the Palestinian state. That's called a compromise. That's called a fair solution. And this is why when you hear these things, you have to think, you have to picture, you have to see a map. And that's what Israelis will show you, because when you say, what's Jewish shall be Israel, what's actually Palestine, it sounds fair. But not until you look at a map and realize what they're talking about, do you realize what they're actually trying to get at. And Barak actually bragged. And he said, Camp David would have given Israel the largest, most Jewish Jerusalem in history. Largest, because he gets to expand the borders all the way out here to Ma'ale Adumim and Mishor Adumim. Most Jewish, because you get to carve away all the Christians and Muslims inside. You don't have to give them sewage treatment, health care, and health insurance and all that. And God forbid you give these Christians and Muslims the right to vote in your Jewish state. You get to carve them out of the way. And then you get to pat yourself on the back and say, see, we compromised. Now, that paradigm, taking land and getting rid of people, was supported even by President Clinton, just so you see to what level this paradigm was taken. Now, if you've been listening closely, you should be able now to predict just about everything Israel's going to do. So when they announced that they were going to build a wall, or a fence, or whatever you want to call it, the effect is the same. When they announced they were going to build a wall, I was rather naive, and I thought, great. Build a wall on the border between Israel and the occupied territories. Because I don't want their settlers and their army terrorizing the Palestinians any more than they want Palestinian extremists terrorizing the Israelis. But remember the paradigm. It's about taking land. It's not about security. And that's why the wall is not being built on the green line. That should have been predictable. If you've been paying attention, you can predict exactly where the wall is going to go. Because it's going to be based on, not security, but on maximizing the amount of Palestinian land on the Israeli side while maximizing the number of Christians and Muslims on the other side. And that's exactly how the wall is being built. You don't even need to see a map. That was predictable based on the Israeli paradigm. This is a map of the wall. Phase 1 is the solid black line in the north, which has already been built. Phase 2 is the red line that you see goes well inside occupied Palestinian territory. That is what is under construction or projected, and this is not Palestinian projection. This comes from the Israeli Foreign Ministry website, Ministry of Defense website. This is what the Israelis openly admit that they're going to do. And then phase 3 has two alternatives. This dotted black line here, which is what our sources tell us the Israeli military has recommended, and then the dotted blue line, which takes even more land, which the Israeli settlers have requested. Now, the Israelis recently said that they're not sure they're going to build the third, this phase 3, the Jordan Valley Wall, because, of diplomatic repercussions. So they might not build it now, but believe me, they already have the plans in place to build it eventually, so don't be surprised when it gets built. Now, the Israelis, the vast majority of Israelis, support a Palestinian state. Sharon even says he supports a Palestinian state, and he says he supports it in 45% of the West Bank. How did he come up with that 45% figure? You're looking at it. All this area on the other side of the wall. And what's so magical about that 45%? It's in that 45% that approximately 100% of the population lives. In other words, what's the smallest amount of territory I can give up while getting rid of the maximum number of Palestinians? That's the motivating factor. And that's why the wall is being built where it is. Now I'm going to show you a close-up of Kalkilia. That's this village right here. But before I get there, you're going to notice that Kalkilia is right on the border with Israel. And that's not a coincidence. In fact, if you see further north, there's Tulkarem and Zeta and Nazat Isa. There are a lot of Palestinian villages in the north of the West Bank right along the border with Israel. Why are they located where they are? And again, you should already know the answer. It's because in 1948, when Israel created itself, it went right up, the forces went right up to the Palestinian population centers, took most of the land that was located on the other side, but stopped before the Palestinian population centers because they didn't want to take the people. Let me show you a close-up of Kalkilia and explain to you what I'm talking about. Most of Kalkilia's land is inside Israel today. It was taken in 48. But they didn't want the people, which is this built-up dark yellow area right here. So it's not a coincidence if they stopped right there. That's why the border is where it is today. And most of Kalkilia's land today is here and to the north. That's what the villagers, or say the townsfolk, actually rely on. There's about 40,000 people in the village of Kalkilia, or at least there was before the wall was being built. Now Israel says the wall's about security, right? Well look, right here's the green line. Rather than build the wall on this half kilometer on the green line, Israel decided to build the wall a good 17 to 20 kilometers all the way around like that. Building it on the green line would have been shorter, would have been cheaper, it would have been more easily patrolled, and therefore more secure. It would have been legal. It wouldn't have violated the rights of the Palestinians on the other side, so you wouldn't have created a lot of animosity against you, which also makes you less secure. So everything dictates that Israel would build the wall right here. So why did they build the wall all the way into the West Bank like that? Well, take a look. This red blob here is Alpei Menashe, and to the north is another Israeli settlement of Zufim. The striped red is the planned Israeli expansion of those settlements. In other words, the wall is built in such a way as to maximize not only the amount of land taken on the Israeli side, but to allow not only the Israeli settlements to remain, but to actually even expand. Take a look at Jayus, this village over here. All of Jayus's 2/3 of its farmland is on the other side of the wall, and all of its water wells is on the other side of the wall. How are they going to survive? Well, they're not going to survive. And then they said, well, we're going to build these agricultural gates to allow farmers to go back and forth. Yeah, they built the gates, but if the whole strategy was to allow farmers to get to their crops, why don't we just build the wall on the other side of the crops? Because ultimately those gates are going to be closed, and in fact, many of them already are. During the Jewish holidays last September, the gates were closed for almost 2 weeks, which happened to coincide with one of the olive harvests. So you can keep those gates open 11 and a half months out of the year, but if you close it during the harvest season, then everything the Palestinians have been working for is for nothing. How long do you think a poultry farm is going to last if you can't feed the chickens? Not 2 weeks. And indeed, the largest poultry farm lost all of its poultry because no one could get to there and feed the chickens. So it's a forced impoverishment of the population. And in fact, many of the farmers of Jehu said, we are not sure these gates are going to be open, and so therefore we're going to go live in our fields. They actually set up tents on their own property, on their own crops. And do you think Israel allowed that? No. They rounded them up and sent them back to Jehu. And they denied many of them the right to go pass through the gate to get to their own land. In the meantime, take a look here. You see there are a few Arab villages caught between the wall and Israel's border. What's going to happen to them? Well, remember the paradigm. Get rid of people. So you know these people are in danger. They're going to be encouraged to leave. And unsurprisingly, last October 2nd, Israel issued a military order that said, this area between the wall and the border is called a closed zone. No one can live there, no one can enter there. 2 exceptions. Those who have a permit. In other words, the Palestinians who live there, who farm that land, who own that land, who rely on that land to earn a living, have to have permission to stay in their own homes from a foreign occupying army. Maybe you get the permission, maybe you don't. Maybe you get it this week, you don't get it next week. Or maybe you get it, but no one honors it. And what Israel has done recently is that it's targeted certain individuals for denial of the permit, namely the heads of households, let's say the father. By denying a permit to the father, they force him to leave, and in all likelihood, all those who are dependent upon him to leave. If he has to leave, the spouse probably has to leave, the kids will soon follow, and Palestinians in these rural communities live very traditionally in extended families. Perhaps the in-laws or other extended relatives will also have to leave because they also rely on that one individual. So by getting rid of one person, you can induce an exodus of many, many more. And that's the strategy. Move these people out. Then Israel says, well, you don't live here anymore, so you don't get a permit to come here. And then a few years later, Israel says, well, this is an abandoned village, so we can just annex it. And that's how it goes. The other exception to the rule on the closed zone, Israelis. They don't need a permit. What a coincidence. And how do they define Israeli? An Israeli citizen, an Israeli resident, or anyone anywhere in the world allowed to immigrate to Israel under the law of return, meaning any Jew anywhere in the world. All right, let's think about this for a second. Any Jew anywhere in the world has the right to move into this illegal settlement in occupied Palestinian territory, while the Christians and Muslims who live on that land, farm that land, own that land, have to have a permit from a foreign occupying army to stay there. The trend is very clear. Encourage Christians and Muslims out, bring more and more Jews in, create a demographic balance that will allow Israel to ultimately annex all of this territory to Israel without having to take in Christians and Muslims that will dilute its demographic balance. That's the goal. And that's what this whole wall is about. And I'll make it very clear. If Israel wants to build the wall on the Green Line, we Palestinians have no objection. In fact, I personally encourage it to do so. But this isn't about building on the Green Line because that doesn't give Israel the land that it wants. You've been very patient with me. Let me show you a few last slides before we open up for questions. Let me show you what's going on around Jerusalem. While the rest of the world has been distracted by all this talk of violence and Arafat needs to do more, Sharon has moved very quickly on the ground to make sure that there are facts that will stay in place. In other words, while the symptom of violence rages on, the very underlying disease of occupation continues unabated and nobody talks about it. And then they wonder, well, gee, why is the symptom going away? Let me show you what's going on around Jerusalem. The yellow areas are Palestinian areas. The red areas are Israeli settlements. This, of course, is Israel up in the northwest Jerusalem. You see where the green line is. All of the other area is occupied Palestinian territory. And what you'll notice here to the north of Bethlehem is this wall of settlements. This one here is Gilo. It's about 40,000 people to the south of Jerusalem. You wouldn't know Gilo is a settlement by reading the American press because they refer to it as a Jewish neighborhood of Jerusalem. Just a Jewish neighborhood. No context to the fact that it's built in occupied territory. No context to the fact that it's built on land stolen from Beit Jala and Bethlehem. Just a Jewish neighborhood of Jerusalem. And if you take a look over here, you'll see this is Har Homa. This settlement was built after the Oslo process started. And it was completed in record time. I think they were able to complete it in 5 years. The first settlers started moving in there last year. Why was it so important for the Israelis to build this settlement and to build it as quickly as they did? Take a look at where it's located. This was the last area of open access from Bethlehem into East Jerusalem through the west of the West Bank, and the Israelis needed to block it off. That's why it was built where it was and why it was built so quickly. And then, so you have this northern wall of settlements, and then just to reinforce it, the wall that Israel has built is right there, this black line, separating the Arabs, the Christians and Muslims of Bethlehem from the rest of Jerusalem, while incorporating all of these settlements into an expanded idea of Israel's Jerusalem. To the south, you have the Etzion block, this block of settlements here, and now, most tellingly, you have what's known as the Zafira Bypass Road. This road connects the northern block of settlements to the southern block of settlements, and that completes the entire encirclement of Bethlehem. Bethlehem and the Palestinian Christians and Muslims who live there are now isolated on this reservation, while Israel continues to build all the way around and to surround Bethlehem so that it cannot continue to expand. Let me take you to the east of Jerusalem.